The fluorescent lights of St. Mercy Hospital flickered faintly against the chipped paint of its aging walls, casting long shadows over the worn linoleum floors. It was nearly midnight, and most of the city beyond lay asleep, but inside the small, underfunded clinic on the outskirts of town, the night shift moved on in quiet urgency. Angela Reed, 32 and bone-tired, stood by the emergency room doors, her scrubs clinging to her from hours of sweat and rain. Her face soft, kind, but etched with exhaustion, betrayed the weight of a life spent giving more than she ever received. She was used to it, the long hours, the low pay, the ache in her feet. She told herself it mattered that kindness, even when unnoticed, still counted for something. Her gaze drifted to the man sitting slumped on a plastic chair near the exit. He looked broken in every possible way, clothes soaked and torn, skin pale, eyes hollow with hunger and defeat. Thomas Blake, they said. His name was 38, no ID, no address, no family. He'd collapsed on the street and been brought in by strangers. The doctors had done what they could, rehydrated him, gave him a few stitches, stabilized his vitals, but there was no medical reason to keep him. Just another lost soul the system would spit back into the cold night. Angela's heart twisted painfully as she watched him tremble, his hands shaking from cold or fear or both. She knew that feeling too well for hopelessness of having nowhere to turn. Without hesitating, she crossed the room, her footsteps quiet on the cracked floor. She crouched down beside him, her eyes gentle as she pressed her last crumpled dollar bill, literally all she had for the night, into his unsteady hand. "Please," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. "Get something to eat." For a moment, his eyes met hers, confused, vulnerable, but alive. It was all she could give. Minutes later, as the rain began again, Angela stepped out into the cold darkness and started the long walk home. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her, stomach gnawing with hunger she couldn't afford to fix. But her steps never faltered. Her breath came out in pale clouds as the rain soaked through her hair, but her face held a quiet dignity, her eyes reflecting both wariness and an ember of stubborn compassion. She didn't know the man's story, didn't know what would become of him, but somewhere deep in her bones, she held on to the fragile belief that sometimes even the smallest help could keep someone alive another day. Her whispered words echoed softly in the night. Asterisk, even the smallest help can keep someone alive another day. Asterisk, she had no way of knowing that this small act, this single, crumpled dollar would one day come back to change her life forever. Angela Reed's life was a quiet battlefield of sacrifices no one ever noticed, by day and often well into the night. She worked double shifts at St. Mercy Hospital, her back aching, her feet blistered, her spirit worn thin. Her paychecks, modest at best, barely stretched far enough to cover her threadbare existence. A tiny, crumbling apartment with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. The kind of place you never truly felt safe in, but couldn't afford to leave. What little money she managed to save was sent religiously to her mother, who lived 2 states away, fragile and housebound after a series of strokes. The burden of her late father's medical debts still haunted her endless student loans, layered with hospital bills she'd inherited when cancer took him years ago. Every envelope that arrived in the mail carried a new weight on her shoulders. But it wasn't just the financial strain that hollowed her out. Angela was lonely in a way that sat deep in her bones. She had once believed in love, in partnership, in the kind of connection that could make life feel less suffocating. But the toxic relationship she'd escaped in her late 20s had left scars she still carried, invisible but raw. Since then, she had built careful walls round her heart, convinced that giving too much of herself emotionally led to ruin. So she gave in other ways, through her work, her kindness, her patience. Yet no matter how much she offered, her days remained steeped in quiet isolation. Even within the walls of St. Mercy, surrounded by the chaos of life and death, she was often invisible. Her boss, Dr. Meredith Hale, with her sharp suits and sharper tongue, treated Angela like a cog in a tired machine, disposable, replaceable, unworthy of real respect. The other nurses and staff kept their distance, too caught up in their own weariness to offer anything more than surface-level small talk. There were no after-shift drinks, no shared laughter in break rooms, just long hours, tired smiles, and the quiet ache of being unseen. Yet, despite the relentless grind, Angela's kindness never faltered. It was the one thing she had clung to, a lesson burned into her heart by her late father, a man who, even in his final days of suffering, had reminded her gently, what you give to the world, even when you have nothing, comes back to you in ways you can't imagine. It was this belief, this stubborn spark of goodness, that had made her press that last crumpled dollar into the hand of a stranger who had nothing. That stranger, Thomas Blake, was a man no one else really saw. Disheveled, gaunt, and overlooked, he had become invisible to the world after losing everything. Once a successful entrepreneur with a thriving tech business, Thomas's life had unraveled through the twin poisons of betrayal and addiction. A trusted business partner had stolen everything, leaving him drowning not only in financial ruin but in personal collapse. Drugs and alcohol numbed the descent until he hit rock bottom, homeless, broken, and utterly forgotten. That dollar Angela had given him wasn't just money, it was the first human kindness he'd felt in years. A thread of warmth in a world that had turned cold. Neither of them knew it yet. But in that small, unremarkable moment, the exchange of a single dollar, something had shifted. Something that, in time, would change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The night unfolded like so many others, thick with exhaustion and the constant hum of urgent voices inside St. Mercy Hospital. But for Angela Reed, everything changed when a frantic mother rushed into the ER, carrying her unconscious child. No insurance, no paperwork, just pure terror in her eyes. Without hesitation, Angela acted, ordering immediate care despite hospital protocol that required clearance for uninsured cases. Her hands moved on instinct oxygen for stabilizing the child's fading vitals, while the mother wept at her side. The boy survived, but Angela's compassion came at a price. Hours later, she was called into Dr. Meredith Hale's office, where the older woman's cold eyes sliced through her like glass. The reprimand was swift and merciless. She had violated policy, exposed the hospital to liability, and put her own position in jeopardy. Angela stood there, shoulders squared despite the knot of fear in her chest, absorbing every sharp word. By the end of the meeting, her future at St. Mercy hung by a thread. Already drowning financially, the blow struck deep. When she returned home that night, another wound awaited, an eviction notice tacked to her door, the red letters like a slap to the face. She had fallen behind on rent, her paychecks too thin to stretch between her own survival and the rising costs of her mother's medication. The numbers didn't add up anymore. She sat on the floor of her tiny apartment, her hands shaking, tears stinging her eyes. Homelessness, something she had never imagined for herself now, loomed closer with every passing hour. Numb, hungry, and utterly drained, Angela walked through the rain toward nowhere in particular, her mind spiraling. That's when she saw him. Thomas cleaned up, standing near the entrance of a soup kitchen, a paper cup of coffee clutched in his hands. He looked different, steadier, less haunted, though the weight of hardship still lingered in his eyes. When their gazes met, recognition sparked immediately. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but filled with earnest gratitude. "You saved me that night," he murmured. "You didn't have to, but you did." His words were simple, but they landed with unexpected warmth. Angela smiled faintly, brushing damp hair from her face, murmured something polite, and kept walking. She didn't think much of it. After all, her own world was crumbling. But as she trudged through the rain, her father's words came back to her asterisk. What you give to the world, even when you have nothing, comes back to you in ways you can't imagine. The choice before her was stark: to shut down, protect herself, and let the world harden her into someone unrecognizable, or to keep giving, even when it meant she might lose everything. The moral stakes were no longer theoretical. They were flesh and bone, heart and survival. And for the first time, Angela didn't know if kindness alone would be enough to save her. The slow unraveling of Angela Reed's life came not with a single blow, but with the steady drip of exhaustion, disappointment, and betrayal. It happened late one evening, the fluorescent lights of St. Mercy Hospital blurring around her as her vision dimmed. She had skipped too many meals, worked too many shifts, poured out every ounce of herself until her body finally gave in. She collapsed right there in the hallway, her knees buckling as darkness closed in. When she came to, surrounded by curious glances and hushed whispers, Dr. Meredith Hale stood over her, arms crossed, eyes sharp with disdain. In front of the other staff, she delivered the humiliation without mercy. Irresponsible, she spat. If you can't take care of yourself, how can you be trusted to care for patients? The words sliced through Angela's dazed mind, but worse than the scolding was the cold indifference in the eyes of her colleagues. No one helped her up. No one offered comfort. The days that followed pushed Angela further into despair. A co-worker she had once trusted, someone she had covered shifts for countless times, quietly maneuvered to take her hours, leaving Angela with a paycheck so thin it barely covered the bus fare to work. She came home each night to an empty fridge, her stomach hollow, her fingers trembling from weakness. The eviction notice remained taped to the wall like a countdown clock she couldn't stop. Her mother's medication costs weighed heavier with each passing day. The deepest wound, though, came not from poverty or physical pain, but from the quiet, unspoken betrayals of those she had once served, the patients whose hands she had held, whose lives she had fought to save, now passed her in the streets or in the hospital halls with blank stares. No recognition, no gratitude. The world she had built on kindness, on the belief that compassion mattered, seemed to turn its back on her completely. In the rare moments alone, curled up on her thin mattress, she whispered into the darkness, "Why do I keep giving when no one ever gives back?" Her faith in people, in goodness itself, began to crack beneath the weight of survival. And yet, somewhere beyond her line of sight, Thomas Blake watched. Not the broken man she had met weeks ago, but someone reborn from the ashes of his own ruin. He had begun to rebuild, quietly working odd jobs, staying clean, relearning the art of living with dignity. He never forgot the moment Angela handed him that last crumpled dollar when she herself had nothing. And though she didn't see it, Thomas watched from a distance as her light began to dim, as her world threatened to swallow her whole. He owed her more than she knew, and the time was coming when he would finally give back. The breaking point came without ceremony, but with devastating finality. Angela Reed, worn to the bone and stripped of nearly everything, made a choice she knew would cost her the last piece of stability she had left. When Dr. Hale coldly refused treatment to a dying homeless man brought into the exciting policy, risk and cost something in Angela snapped. With her voice trembling but fierce, she stood her ground in front of the entire staff, her words cutting through the sterile air. Every life matters, or nothing does. The confrontation was swift, public, and unforgivable in Dr. Hale's eyes. By the end of her shift, Angela was fired. Just like that, discarded, erased. After years of service and sacrifice, she walked home through the cold twilight, her hands numb, her heart heavier than it had ever been. When she reached her building, the sight stopped her in her tracks. Her belongings, what little she had piled haphazardly on the curb, some already soaked by the drizzle. Eviction had arrived ahead of schedule. No job, no money, no home. She stood there, motionless, as people passed without a glance, the city moving on without her. The weight of it, or years of quiet endurance, of kindness met with indifference breast, until she could barely breathe. Then, out of the fog of her despair, a sleek black car pulled to the curb. The door opened, and a man stepped out. A man she barely recognized until their eyes met. Thomas, but not the broken, tattered version of the man she remembered. He was clean-cut now, his sharp suit tailored, his face steady and clear. Confidence radiated from him, but not arrogant something, gentler, something grateful. Angela's breath caught in her throat. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the street. Thomas stepped closer, his voice soft but sure. "I'm Thomas Blake," he said quietly. "I built a company. Once, I lost everything, and then I found my way back." His eyes never left hers. "Because of you." Angela shook her head, retreating a step, her pride, her last shield rising instinctively. "I don't need charity," she said hoarsely, her fingers clutching the frayed strap of her bag. "I can figure this out." But Thomas didn't let her go. He closed the distance, his voice breaking with raw emotion. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't care. You gave me everything when you had nothing. That night you saved my life. Let me do the same for you." The words, so simple, so true, shattered something inside her. All the walls, all the silent battles she had fought alone, all the endless holding on, collapsed in an instant. Angela's breath hitched, and then, for the first time since everything began, she let herself break. The tears came hard and fast, racking her body as she sank to her knees on the wet pavement, not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of finally being seen, finally being saved. Thomas knelt beside her, his hands steady on her back as the night held them both to broken souls stitched back together by the quiet, unstoppable power of kindness repaid. In the weeks that followed, Angela's life shifted in ways she never could have imagined, gently, carefully, like the first fragile signs of spring after a brutal winter. Thomas, true to his word, offered her not charity, but purpose, the chance to lead a new healthcare initiative. His company was launching a fully funded non-profit clinic dedicated to providing care for the city's most underserved communities. It was everything Angela had always fought for, but never believed she'd have the power to build. At first, she hesitated. The fear of dependence, the sting of pride, the rawness of her recent wounds still clung to her. But Thomas was patient. He made no grand speeches, no demands, only the quiet, unwavering truth. "You gave me back my life. This is me giving back to yours." Slowly, the walls she built around her heart softened. She accepted. The changes rippled outward. Angela moved into a modest but warm apartment where the lights stayed on and the fridge was full. Her mother, with Thomas's resources and quiet assistance, received proper care in a reputable facility, dignity restored after years of neglect by a system that had failed them both. With each passing day, Angela found herself standing taller, her shoulders no longer weighed down by survival alone. She began to see herself not through the lens of everything she had lost, but through the quiet victories she had won. Her integrity, her compassion, her refusal to let the world harden her. She was not a victim, she was a survivor. And more than that, she was a woman capable of creating change. For Thomas, the transformation was equally profound. He often said, when no one else was listening, that Angela hadn't just saved his life. That rainy night outside St. Mercy Shea had saved his soul. Her simple act of kindness had been the first thread that pulled him back from the abyss, reminding him that human worth wasn't tied to success, wealth, or status. It was tied to compassion, to dignity, to the quiet acts of goodness that ask for nothing in return. He credited her with giving him not just a second chance, but the courage to become the man he was meant to be. Together, without fanfare or drama, they built something lasting. And in the steady rhythm of new beginnings, both Angela and Thomas healed not because life suddenly became perfect, but because they chose, day after day, to believe in kindness, in redemption, and in the quiet power of simply not giving up. The soft hum of conversation filled the air of the new clinic, its walls still fresh with paint, the scent of coffee and comfort mingling with the quiet rhythm of healing. Angela stood behind the small welcome desk, her hands steady as she passed a steaming bowl of soup and a sandwich to a thin, shivering man who reminded her, achingly, of Thomas on that long-ago night. Her touch was gentle, her smile warm. "Here," she said softly, "something to eat." The man's eyes met hers, confused, grateful, fragile. In that small exchange, time seemed to fold in on itself. The gesture mirrored the moment her own life had changed, when she had given her last dollar to a stranger because it was the only thing she could give. Now, standing in this space she helped build, surrounded by the quiet hum of second chances, Angela felt the fullness of it all. As the man stepped away, clutching the meal like something precious, Angela moved to the clinic's front window. Outside, the city moved as it always had, busy, indifferent, alive. She exhaled slowly, her breath soft against the glass. The weight that had once lived in her chest, the bone-deep loneliness, the fear, none of it was gone entirely, but it no longer defined her. She had made it through, not because life had become easy, not because the world had suddenly turned kind, but because she had refused to let it change the core of who she was. Her eyes softened, her lips curved into the faintest smile as the closing thought drifted through her mind, like a quiet truth she now understood in her bones. $1, one moment. One act of kindness can rewrite a lifetime. And as the light spilled through the window, Angela stood still, calm, peaceful, no longer lost, no longer broken, finally, fully herself.